if you would find in your Bible, please, the book of Esther. Old Testament book of Esther, nestled between the book of Nehemiah and the book of Job. We continue our examination of this book. And you remember I said when we started that chapter 3 of this book is the pivotal chapter of the book. Chapters 1 and 2, which we looked at last week, lay out in detail how it is that Esther, a Jewess, an exiled Jew, is able to rise to become the queen of Persia. And as we come to chapter 3, then we come to the center of the book, the pivot of the book, which, of course, is the plot of Haman to destroy the Jews. And everything from that particular point then moves forwards. Chapters 1 and 2 then are in this book as an anticipation of what comes in chapter 3. So what we looked at last week and seeing Esther rise to the role of queen is an anticipation of what's going to come here in chapter 3. The remaining chapters then of the book, the story, outline how this particular threat is thwarted, particularly as Esther herself has risen to this role. And so the idea of chapter 3 then is to bring forth the threat. Chapters 1 and 2 then will tell us how this is taken care of as the book unfolds. However, there is a brief parenthesis in verses 19 to 23 of chapter 2. The very end of chapter 2, this last paragraph, belongs as a parenthesis in this book. It outlines how it is that Mordecai is able to thwart the threat that Haman will bring in chapter 3. So again, notice its anticipatory nature. Just like the first parts of chapter 1 and 2 anticipate the threat in the rise of Queen Esther, you see the same thing here. There's an anticipation here of what's going to come later as this little bit unfolds. So it outlines how it is that Mordecai is able to thwart the threat of Haman. But here's the tremendous irony of the book. Now, there's many ironies in this book. Okay, this book is filled with ironies. But here's one that I think is just fascinating. It is Mordecai's actions after this event that precipitate the threat of Haman. The irony here is Haman is going to be able to act to thwart the very threat that Haman brings, but it's Haman's own actions which precipitate the threat itself. Notice the irony. All right, so let's see what it is that the writer would have us to do. Again, as I mentioned last week, I'm not going to have the time to read through all of the text. I would encourage you to do that in advance of coming on Sunday. Read it as a part of your devotional time during the week, or just as something that you would read just as a part of keeping up with your Bible reading. Now, when we come to verse 19, it says that the writer times the event to when the virgins were gathered together a second time. Now, we have no idea what that means. Okay? So right off the bat, we're not really sure what that exactly means. No one really does. I scoured a number of scholars over the week trying to figure that out. They're not really sure. Here's what they do know, though, and it's fairly obvious. It's connected back, that term virgins is connected back to verse 2. So it seems to refer to a second gathering of what I called last week the queen harem. You remember when the king established a group of women that he would choose a queen from? Now that appears to meet again in some sort of way, seems to be the implication. I'm guessing possibly that this is some sort of celebratory gathering of the various women who were not chosen to be the queen to honor Esther as the queen. The rest of these women who were a part of this process get the opportunity to come and to speak or to celebrate the fact that Esther has risen to the queen, to the role of queen. Now, here's the thing. Here's the point of it. Something big is happening at the palace. Something big is happening at the palace. There's some sort of great celebration or something that's going on there. And we don't know how long it lasted. It could have been, you remember the first feast was 7 days long. Who knows how long this particular celebration took. But something big is happening. And the plot that is revealed in these words is related somehow. Okay, so there's a sense in which the plot that Mordecai uncovers here has something to do with this celebration. Okay, the writer puts it this way, I think. The writer also notes, and you'll notice it's in there twice, that Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate. He's sitting at the gate of the city, or my better guess is he's sitting at the gate of the palace, some sort of the outward rim of the palace, a gate leading into the place. And it was customary, you remember, for officials to sit at the city gate or at the gate of the palace and dispense justice. What happened is typically an individual who had been raised to a position of authority in the land would sit at the gate, and people who had a dispute of some sort with someone else would come there, and this individual would dispense justice. He would decide the case in some way. We have examples of this, a lot of examples of this actually in the Old Testament. For example, Lot in Genesis 19 sat at the gate and dispensed justice. We see Absalom, David's son, doing so in 2 Samuel 15. In the book of Ruth, we have Boaz sitting at the city gate dispensing justice. These men would sit and they would adjudicate cases there at the gate, try to decide who was right in the situation and dispense justice. It is likely then that Mordecai is sitting there at the gate and has the opportunity to perform this task because Esther is the queen. How do you think he got to his role? How do you think he got appointed to this particular place? It would appear that because Esther had been raised to the position of queen, she's able to make some sort of influence over the king to allow him to pursue this particular thing. Notice what it says in verse 20. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. You catch that? Mordecai is still having an influence over this woman who's now queen of Persia, and Mordecai still has some sort of control over her. Well, she will still obey him. I think that's a subtle way of the writer saying that the reason why Mordecai has this position is because Mordecai got Esther to give him the job. Now, you remember I said last week that Mordecai has pursued Esther to her royal position. Remember? He was involved in making sure that she got into the queen harem and that he was there every day, and he was in some way influencing that. He wanted her to rise to this position, or at least to have the opportunity to do so. I don't think in his wildest imaginations that he thought she might actually be queen, but here she is. And I would argue that Mordecai had, through this situation, self-advancing motives. He's not doing this for some sort of future protection of the Jewish people. There's no threat yet. Remember? There's no threat yet. We haven't seen a threat yet in this book. All we have is a man who has put forth his cousin to go into this harem. Why is he doing that? And why does he walk around every day and make sure? And why does she continue to obey him even though she's now the queen? And I think the answer is because he has self-advancing motives here. That doesn't mean he's evil. All right, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that he's a man of his times. What is he doing? He's pursuing the best that he can get. And he's got this beautiful cousin who's now the queen that he can use to some ends. So here he is sitting at the gate. And while he's there, there's a plot that is unveiled, starting in verse 21. The developers of this plot are two men by the name of Bigthan and Teresh. I'm not sure, by the way, if this Bigthan is the same man mentioned in chapter 1, verse 10, a man by the name of Bigtha. It's possible that's the same name. I'm not sure, but it could very well be. What we do know is that these two men were eunuchs. You remember I said last week that eunuchs were men who were physically altered, we'll leave it at that, to serve the women of the king, right? They were physically altered so that they would have no designs upon the women. Okay, so they are men who were put into this position of serving the queen, and they served, it says, at the threshold of the king. Now I want you to recognize who these men are. These are men who have access to the very most intimate place of the king and his wife. The king's private quarters are where these men have access to. They have access to the very innermost part of the life of this king and his queen. They had access to the most intimate locations and activities of the king himself, which is probably the reason why they decided to launch a plot, because they have access. Now, these two men, it says, hatch a plot to lay hands on the king. That is a euphemism to kill him, assassinate him. I mean, really, what are they really going to do here, right? Let's just choke him. No. No, they're making a plot to kill this king. It's obviously an assassination plot. Their punishment that you get at the very end of this section indicates that that's how the king perceived it, as a threat against his own life. And so that's what they make. A plot to assassinate the king. Now, I don't know why. It doesn't say why, does it? There's no indication in the text as to why. However, given the fact that they're very close to the king and they have access to the most intimate aspects of his life, I'm guessing, and this is just sanctified speculation here, I'm guessing that they've got a problem with Esther being the queen. Could very well be that these are two men who have decided that, well, Esther wasn't the best choice. Or they were shut out in some way from the decision-making process. They didn't get their particular choice into that particular role. It doesn't say, but all those are certainly good possibilities, given the context, and I think most importantly, given the fact that Mordecai is the one that overhears this. The substance comes to the knowledge of Mordecai. Again, it's not said how. We don't know how it is that Mordecai becomes aware of this, but we can assume, I think, by implication, that the information got to him by the providence of God. Right? How does he know? Doesn't say, but God got this information to his ears. It'll become essential, as I said earlier, it'll become essential to how this story unfolds that Mordecai knows this and Mordecai is able to report it. It'll become important to the story. So the only conclusion that we can come to that's perfectly valid is that God, in his providence, somehow, in some way, brought this plot to the knowledge of Mordecai. Again, this book is filled with the providence of God, isn't it? I mean, we spent an entire sermon last week talking about the providence of God working to get Esther to become the queen. So it seems reasonable that this is, again, another examination of the providence of God. I couldn't help but think about the fact that men who are planning an assassination attempt do not publicly make that known, right? You hide that information. So how it is that Mordecai came to it, we do not know, but nonetheless, it is revealed to him. Mordecai relays the substance of the plot to Esther. Esther tells the king, she's the queen. The king investigates the matter, and the two plotters are hanged. Notice how quickly all of that is summarized in the text. Bang, 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 bang. Which is, by the way, pretty good evidence that the writer really isn't interested in those details. Right? All that's just subtext. The plot's revealed, the queen makes it known to the king goes out and investigates the matter, the two men are found guilty and they're hanged. Okay, all of that's done fairly quickly. What's the point of it, though? The point of it is the very last part of the section. Verse 23, when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were hanged on the gallows. And, all right, here's what matters. It was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. It's that last sentence that establishes the point of the entire section. The entire section goes along fairly quickly, right? A couple of guys make up a plot. Mordecai hears about it. He relays it to Esther. Esther relays it to the king. The king investigates it. The men are hanged. But we get to the end. Here's the point. All of it is written down in the Chronicles of the king. The recording of the event in the King's Chronicle will be key to how the plot of Haman is overturned in chapter 6. As you read on in the story, this event will come up again at a key point along the way. So as I said, it's a parenthesis that you see from 19 to 23. It's just a short little text with one little point to it, and that is that Mordecai found out about a plot and it was written down in a book. And it'll come up again later. Now we turn to chapter 3. Now we come to the totality of this book. We come to its pivot point, all right? And we are introduced immediately to the antagonist of the story. I think that's right? From my English class from so many years ago? You got a protagonist and an antagonist, right? Okay, here's the antagonist. I'm still convinced, by the way, that Mordecai is the protagonist of this book, and it really should be named the Book of Mordecai, but we won't go there. He's the bad guy, all right? He's the guy that's the bad guy in the story. He's the one who is the bad guy, as it would be known in typical storytelling. Now, unfortunately, we don't know much about him, okay? There's not much given to him in terms of background, but we do get a few things, and we can draw some conclusions about a few things from what the writer does include. First, we know he is an Agagite. Agagite, okay? It's a fun word to say, Agagite. Now, we think that this Agagite then is a descendant of a man by the name of Agag, who is mentioned in the book of 1 Samuel, particularly 1 Samuel 15. This Agag was the king of the Amalekites in that day. And if you remember from your study of history of Israel, that when the first king of Israel, Saul, was told by God to destroy the Amalekites, Saul decided not to do that, but instead took some of the best of all the Amalekites had, including their king, whose name was Agag, and kept him and kept some of the stuff. And God said, you blew it, my son, you blew it. He's supposed to destroy them. He was supposed to wipe them out. Now, let me just pause for a moment here and point out that the reason why God would have the Israelites destroy entire nations of people, it's one of those questions that people ask all the time, right? Why does God seem genocidal in the Old Testament? And the answer is always for us to remember that the Amalekites were not some neutrally moral, upright people. They were a people who were wicked beyond our imaginations. In fact, the Amalekites, along with a lot of other of the Canaanite residents of the time, practiced human sacrifice. They had all kinds of wickedness that was a part of their culture. And the threat of those people continuing to survive on this planet is that their ways, their culture might seep into the rest of humanity. Meaning that we might be practicing human sacrifice today if, in fact, these people have been allowed to live. They have been given plenty of time to repent, and they had chosen to rebel and remain rebellion against whatever light they had from their Creator. And the reality is that God said they need to be destroyed because if you don't destroy them, there's the threat that they might do harm. Well, I take you back to Esther. If this man indeed is a descendant of Agag, then what God said about destroying those people is certainly true. Because they did not, here we are, 600 years later, and they're still around, and they're still a threat. God says, sometimes this is necessary, because I am a holy God, and because wickedness must be destroyed. I mean, we have a flood to prove it, right? Saul was supposed to eradicate them, but his refusal to do so not only cost him his throne, but it continued this blood feud between the Israelites and the Amalekites. At this particular point in time, between the Jews and the Agagites, of which this man was a descendant. Which, by the way, probably explains why he decides to commit genocide himself. See it? Since they tried to wipe us out, now it's time for us to wipe them out, sort of thing. Now, a second reality of this man by the name of Haman is that he is probably an exiled person himself. Remember, the Jews are in exile here. They have been cast from their homeland, and they have been scattered throughout the Persian Empire. That, of course, happened under the Babylonians, but now under the Persians, they have been scattered. This man, given that he's not Persian, he's an Agagite, must imply to me that he's also an exile. So he's living in the Persian Empire away from his native land, which, by the way, is the same land that the Jews occupied. Okay. So he's living away as an exiled person as well. Now, he is probably, therefore, in exile from some sort of previous conquest that either the Persians or the Babylonian predecessors or even the Assyrians before them may have accomplished. And so he's off in his own exile, which I think helps explain his reaction to Mordecai in this story. This is a man who I think is desperate for honor in a foreign land. Desperate for honor in a foreign land. He's looking to be raised to a position of honor. Now, in all fairness, Mordecai is the same, okay? Mordecai's a man desperate for honor as well, right? He gets his cousin to be raised up to the level of queen so he can sit at the gate and become a great official there. Haman's in exactly the same place, all right? The difference between the two should be obvious as the story unfolds, but nonetheless, they do have that in common. But this Haman is advanced by the king. He's advanced and set. It says that his throne is above all the officials who were with him. In that case, throne doesn't mean king. Throne means just place of honor or place of position. Somehow, again, the story doesn't tell us. The writer of this book leaves a lot of details out, doesn't he? But somehow this Agagite manages to work his way into a high position. Somehow he manages to become the chief confidant of the king. I think you could almost argue that this Haman becomes the prime minister. You might say he rises to a position in which he is second to the king. I mean, that's kind of how the language reads. Above all the officials who were with him. Who else would be above him then? Well, the only possibility would be the king. So it's sort of like he's in a prime minister position. He's right at the top. The king orders all of the other officials and servants to pay homage to him, to bow down before him in his position as second to the king himself. And so he's given this position of being at the very top of Persia at this point. Everybody else is to give deference to him as though he represents the position of the king himself. And if you think about it, that's what a prime minister does, right? A prime minister represents the monarchy in the government. Which explains, again, his absolute anger to Mordecai's response. Now notice verses 3 and 4. Then the end of verse 2. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. And then in verse 3 it says, the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to him, why do you transgress the king's command? Why do you not pay homage to this Haman? Why do you not bow down before him? The word homage here in the Hebrew means to bow down in worship. It means to prostrate oneself before another person and offer to him the kind of worship that you would offer to a god. That's what the word means. Why do you not do this, Haman? I think that there are at least 7 different reasons here why Mordecai does not pay this kind of worship unto Haman. First, he does not want to pay homage to an Agagite, a people he knows are under God's judgment, going all the way back to about 1000 BC, about 600 years earlier. He doesn't want to give homage to someone who he perceives as being someone under the judgment of God. Secondly, he certainly does not agree that Haman deserves to be in this position. He certainly doesn't believe Haman deserves to be in this position. Now, are you not catching the ironies here? The 2 eunuchs who Mordecai uncovered probably didn't like the fact that Queen Esther had been put into her position, and so Mordecai turns around and says, I don't think you deserve to be in your position. There's very little respect here, is there? Thirdly, I think another reason why Mordecai does not bow down to this man is because he knows the true nature of the man. He knows the true nature of Haman. He knows who he really is, and he refuses to aid the ruse. This guy thinks he's something fantastic and great. No, you're not. Fourth, Mordecai does not bow down, I think, because he's confident in his own position, particularly as the cousin of the queen. I'm not going to bow down to you. You may be the prime minister, but the queen's above you. And I'm the cousin of the queen. Oh, and she's there because, well, gee, I got it to happen. So I'm not bowing down to you. No. Fifthly, I think he does not bow down also because he knows it's only a matter of time before the king remembers the revelation in the previous parenthesis. I don't need to bow down to this guy because the king's going to remember eventually what I did. I'm important around here. And then finally, I think, and most importantly, he knows that to pay homage to Haman is to give to Haman what only God deserves. Now again, this is a book that never mentions God, right? Okay, so we have to surmise that. But it seems reasonable to me that one of the reasons, in all of the reasons that Mordecai would not bow down to this man is because paying homage or worship to this man would be antithetical to what it means to worship the God of the Israelites. To bow down. Here's the thing. I want you to think about this. After the exile, after the Babylonian exile, the people of Israel seem to have learned their lesson about bowing down to idols. They seem to have learned that lesson. The primary reason that they were carted off to exile in the first place is because they continually chased after other gods, quote unquote, in their worship. You read the history of Israel, as you see it in 1st and 2nd Kings particularly, is the picture of a people who continually chase after other gods, worshiping other gods, chasing after idols. God carts them off to exile. They come back, and then you read the gospel accounts, which speak of the Jews after this, 400 years later, but still after this, and you see a very strong aversion amongst the Jewish people around Jesus not to chase after idols. You see it? So I think that one of the primary lessons that Mordecai has learned being carted off to exile by virtue of being one of these Jews in exile is that you don't bow down and give worship to anyone or anything other than God himself. Therefore, Mordecai says, I refuse to bow down and honor you. Now, again, I think all those other reasons are valid as well. Remember, human beings are not monolithic. There's a lot of reasons why we do things. Even when we do right things, sometimes we have very selfish motives in doing right things. But the primary one, I think, in this particular case is that he does not wish to give to God what God only deserves. So, the very simple principle that we should take out of this text is that we as followers of Christ are to only give homage to God. Right? For he alone is worthy of our worship. Now, you know that. I mean, that's, preaching to the non-existent choir back here. That's something you know. I shouldn't even have to say that, right? But have you ever stopped to consider this? We say, as followers of Christ, that we are not to pay homage to others. But have you ever stopped to think of what the possible consequences of that might be? Part of our problem is that we agree fully in the principle, but we struggle against the consequences of it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if we're really going to say in this life, I will only pay homage to Jesus Christ as Lord, am I willing to suffer the loss that might mean in this life to do so? If I say to my boss, I will only bow down to Christ, I will not bow down to you, I will not bow down to this evil or this idol or that idol, are you willing for your boss to say, you're fired? Or, in saying that we will give homage only to God, are we willing, really willing, to abandon those things that are truly idols in our lives? Are we really, even first of all, willing to ask the question, what is it that I'm really worshiping? What is it that I'm pursuing after? What is it that I'm worshiping? Even though I may not have a statue in my home of this particular idol, all of us are subject to the temptation of having idols in our hearts, of things that we will chase after as most important to our existence, and not even realize that we are in fact worshiping or bowing down to our own Haman in our own hearts. You see, those are the questions that we really need to ask. The hard question is not, do I agree that I'm supposed to worship God? We would all agree with that. But the foundational question is, what am I willing to suffer for that? What am I willing to sacrifice for that? Mordecai put himself here, frankly, in a dangerous situation in refusing to bow down to this man because, if you notice closely, the king himself is the one who ordered all of the officials to bow down to this Haman. He was not just violating Haman's desires, he's violating the desires of the emperor himself, the man who is the husband of his cousin. How willing are we to suffer or sacrifice in order to pursue true worship of God? In verses 5 and 6, then, we see Haman's response. He became, it says in the ESV, filled with fury. Understatement of understatements. Haman's response turns from a filled with anger to a genocidal rage. Verse 6, he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. I think he probably realized he might have trouble doing that. But nonetheless, given that he was as angry as he was, he made it known to him, as it was made known to him who the people of Mordecai were, the Jews. Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom. Haman's response, as I said, turns from an anger against Mordecai, one could even argue a just anger against Mordecai, into a genocidal rage against the entirety of Mordecai's people, which leads then to the plot itself, starting in verse 7. Haman begins plotting, it says, in the first month of the 12th year of King Xerxes, or King Ahasuerus. Now, you remember I said that the first 2 chapters of this book represent 11 years of elapsed time, starting from the first year of this reign of this king to now his 12th year. So there's 11 years have gone by. So the writer accordions together 11 years of time into 2 chapters, but now he expands the rest of the book to cover a year, to cover just 1 year, because it is, of course, the central event of the time. So the plot begins in the 12th year of the reign of Xerxes. This would be in 474 BC, 5 years after Esther has been raised to queen. Okay? Honeymoon's over. She's now settled into her role as queen, right? She's there in the palace. She's the queen. 5 years, all said and done. All the assassination plots, by the way, I think have been uncovered at this point, and so everything is copacetic. Now notice what happens here. Haman works out the details of his plot for almost a full year. He spends almost a full year figuring out exactly what it is that he wants to do, and more specifically, it says that he casts pur, which is the Persian word for lots. By the way, it's where we're going to get the word Purim later on in this book. He casts lots with his officials every month to determine, and by the way, this is superstitiously attempting to determine, the exact timing of his genocidal attack. The specific day on which to launch his genocidal attack against the Jews. Okay? You see it? They cast that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month. So for 12 full months, they're casting lots. What day? What day? What day? And then in verse 9, as the plot now is completed, Haman comes to the king. Once he has his entire plan in place, he then approaches the king for permission. Now, I think it took him a year, not just to cast lots to determine the day, but also to put together all the plans and all the peoples that he would need and everything that he would need in order to get this done. This is going to be a large undertaking. He knows it, and so he needs to figure it all out, and so he takes a year to do that. He also seethes, I think, for a year. So he comes to the king, and here's what he does. He comes to the king for permission, because he doesn't have the authority to do this on his own. Obviously, he wouldn't have the authority to dispatch a genocidal attack in the Persian Empire over against the wishes of the king, so he has to come to the king. So here's what he does. He makes 4 specific arguments to the king in the hope that the king will accept his plot. First, he contends that the Jews are scattered everywhere. Okay, they're dispersed all over the place. Now, what does he mean by that? He means that because they are so dispersed amongst all the other peoples, they are becoming an uncontrollable group of people. Because they're everywhere, they're hard to control. They're scattered everywhere, and that, you get a few of them over here to do what you want, and then the rest of them over there aren't doing what you want. Remember, we're talking about an empire that's, I don't even know what the geographical distance is. It's at least 1,000 miles across from the Indus River to the borders of Greece at this point. And we're talking about a long distance that this empire exists. They're scattered all throughout that. So he's implying to the king they're uncontrollable. Second, he contends that they do not keep the laws of the king, but defer to their own laws. Now, that's not untrue. It's just untrue the way he put it. He spun it. Yes, they do have a law, and they follow that law in terms of worshiping their God, but that doesn't mean they're not keeping the king's laws at the same time. But that's the way he spins it. They're keeping their law, they're not keeping yours. Okay? In other words, they're a bunch of anarchists. Thirdly, he contends that the Jews are not profitable to the king. All these Jews scattered throughout your kingdom, they don't really bring in any value to you. They're not of any help to you. They don't provide anything to the treasury. They don't provide anything to the military. They're not effective people. So if you get rid of them, you won't even miss them. And then fourthly, and this is the bow that ties it all over, he offers to pay the king 10,000 talents of silver. A bribe. 12 million ounces of silver. To say to the king, let me do this. It's a bribe. It's an unmitigated bribe. There's no doubt about it. I'll give you 10,000 talents. So he argues they're everywhere, they're uncontrollable, they don't keep your laws, they don't really provide anything anyways, and I'll give you 10,000 talents, let me get rid of them. So the king authorizes the plan. Notice verse 10. Yep, go ahead. The king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And he said to him, the money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. In fact, here's what's even another irony of the story. The king says, great, you're going to give me 10,000 talents of silver? Terrific. You can use that money to pay for the genocide. So Haman issues an edict. He uses the signet ring of the king, which is the seal placed upon the paper, if you will. The edict is to kill every Jew throughout the empire on a single day. On one day, off in the future, kill all the Jews. The edict itself is issued in the first month of the next year. So this will be the 13th year of Xerxes. So we've moved now to 473 BC. So a whole year has passed that he's plotted. He goes to the king. He gets his way. The very next month, the very first month of the very next year of the king's rule, this is when the edict is issued. And it's to be executed, pardon the pun, on the 13th day of the 12th month, about 1 year from now. So Haman spends a year plotting it, gets permission, and then he sets the date of the execution for a year in advance, a year from now. Now, why would it take so long? Simple. The size of the empire would require that much time for the edict to be circulated, number one, so that everybody would get it, and the necessary preparations to be made in advance in every province, so that everything is put into place for a year from now. All right, so here's what we're going to need. We're going to need everybody to know about the edict first, so we're going to have to get it out. You know, they didn't have email in those days, right? You had to take a scroll and you had to hoof it across the empire. So who knows how long it would have taken to get from Susa to Greece? A while, I imagine. Okay, so it's got to get there, and then once it gets there, then the officials in that particular area have to round up all the military that they can and get everybody that they need and all the weapons and everything they're going to need in order to accomplish the task. So Haman knows it's going to take a whole year of preparation to get this genocide in place. Now, irony of ironies here. He sets the date for a year from now, thinking that's how much time it's going to take for the attack to come, but it's also going to give God time to intervene. He doesn't pull the trigger for the next day. He pulls the trigger for a year from now. And so it gives God time to interfere by virtue of his providence. Now, we'll look into more of those details as we pull the trigger on this as the chapters go by, okay? But now we have the edict in place. Here is a man under a desire to do genocide, and he has convinced the king, and he is ready to go do it. The edict has been issued. So this leads me to a question. The question, I think, that really comes out of this chapter. Why would Xerxes agree to such a genocide in his empire? Or, I guess we could flip the question over and say, why would Haman propose such a thing? Why would Haman pursue a genocide of a people? Why would a king allow it? Why would a man propose it? Is that really not the same question? To me, it seems like it. Two different men, yes, but it's the same basic idea, right? Why would anyone allow or desire or pursue the genocide of a people? Now, again, we're not talking about God here, as I spoke of earlier. He had his reasons for eliminating the Amalekites. Why would these men, under no direction from a deity of any kind, want to commit a genocide? Why would the Persian king want this to happen in his own land? Let me offer to you two reasons. First, because Xerxes is a man of his times. First and foremost, we've got to keep this in mind. We're talking about a period of time around 500 or so BC in which we are looking at a man who is a cold-blooded, ruthless ruler. We're not talking about your friendly neighborhood king, okay? We're not talking about Charles, the supposed future king of Britain. I don't think his mother's ever going to die, so he's never going to get it. But the fact is that it's not Charles, okay? We're not talking about a buffoon who hasn't got a clue. We're talking about a man who's ruling a vast empire. And as we looked at last week, you remember, he's the one who undertook the Battle of Thermopylae. He's the one who slaughtered the Greeks. He's the one who is willing to kill at a moment's notice because he's a cold-blooded, ruthless ruler. He felt free to destroy anything or anyone that stood in his way in order to control as much power as he could. He's a ruthless man because that's what ruthless men do. So frankly, I'm not really surprised at all that he would allow it, because I think Haman, from the king's perspective, makes a pretty good argument. You don't need these people. They're not profitable to you. And they're a bunch of uncontrollable anarchists anyway. So if you get rid of them, it's not really going to harm you. So he's a man of his times. He's a man who's ruthless just by virtue of being an emperor. But there's a second reason, and this is the most important one. And this is the one I think really shines out of this chapter. Not only does he allow it because of his man of his times, but he allows it because he's a man of his nature. He's a man of his nature. This is a man who is a picture of visible testimony to a rebellious human being. who, by virtue of his hatred of his own Creator, saw in the Jews that which threatened his comfort to be depraved. Let me say that again. This is a rebellious human being. He is a man not only of his times, but he's a man of his nature. He is a man who, by his very nature, as a rebellious human being, as one who denies a Creator and pursues the lusts of his flesh. I give you chapter 1 and 2 as my proof text. A man who is pursuing the flesh with everything that he has is a picture of a man who saw in the Jews something which threatened his comfort to be depraved. He was comfortable in his depravity, and he didn't want anything to disturb it. Haman's argument is, these people are nothing to you, and they might even be a problem to you. They might surface to become a people who might threaten your comfort, so eliminating them is the right thing to do. Now let me put before you a principle that explains something. Those who find favor with God represent a grave threat to the depraved heart. Let me say that again. Those who find favor with God are a grave threat. They represent a grave threat to the depraved heart. Let me ask you a question. Why have the Jews been hated for so many centuries? What is it exactly about these people that makes the rest of the world want to get rid of them? Have they done something specific? I mean, in this particular text, what have they done? Nothing. Inherently, I mean, Mordecai has, but generally speaking, what have these people done? The fact of the matter is that those who find favor with God represent a great threat. There's no explanation as to why the world wants to get rid of these people other than the fact that they represent an existential threat to personal autonomy in our lusts of the flesh. The anti-Semitism, and I would argue the anti-Christian perspective of the West now, that we're seeing very much, is a threat to those who want to live in the lusts of their flesh, who desire to pursue their personal autonomy and their willingness to do what they want and only what they want. In other words, when sinners look on a favored people, they inherently know that their own sinfulness stands in judgment under the one who favors these people. You get it? A people that are favored by God become an existential threat to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world looks at the favored people and says, those people imply by their existence that I cannot live out my lusts. You see, we see it going on all around us, do we not? We have a great victory at the Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision, and now men can marry men and women can marry women. And so now the culture wars are over, right? It's over. They've got what they want. They'll leave us alone. Ha! Oh, no. They're not going to be satisfied until we are gone. Because we represent an existential threat to them. They look at us and what do they see? They see judgment. We don't even have to say it. They see it in us. I give you the end of Romans 1 as the perfect explanation of this. These Jews represented a threat to this king, because when he looked at them, he saw his own lusts and he saw the judgment of his own lusts in them. And when the world looks at us as followers of Christ, what do they see? They see an existential threat. They see the fact that they are sitting in judgment under God. Now let me put before you a truth. Contrary to our very recent experience, I say very recent as this experiment in democracy now comes to a close. Contrary to our very recent experience, genuine followers of Christ who bow down only to Him, again, notice, they will suffer persecution at the hands of lawless men. But that persecution is ordained by God as a means through which He brings us to Himself in holiness. We're all afraid of persecution, right? And opposition as believers. We need to work harder in the political realm to stop it. But let me tell you, my friends, this opposition is ordained upon us by God, just as it is here. Jesus Himself said these words, "Behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his own child. And children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher, and the servant like his master." Jesus' point is simple. If they killed me, they will kill you, because you represent a threat to their existence. Jesus was put on a cross because He represented a threat to the power structures of His day, to chief priests who knew that their entire livelihood was based on the temple. And this Jesus was going around saying that the temple was going to be destroyed and men were going to worship Him in spirit and in truth, and they strung Him up because they couldn't handle it, because He represented a threat to their existence. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you represent a threat to the world around you, and they will hate you, and they will turn you over, they will persecute you. I praise God that we've had this short experiment in freedom, in which you've had the opportunity to worship God without the fear of the authorities. But do not be naive, my friends. Those days are rare and ending. Those who truly bow down only to this Yahweh, who will not pay homage to others, who will give homage only to Yahweh, who will only give worship to Jesus Christ, the one who sits at the right hand of the Father, we will suffer. We will suffer. There is a genocide that is desired to take place to get rid of us. But here's the good news. God will intervene. He will save His people. He will not necessarily save them from the trouble, but He will save them in the end from what that trouble will mean. Our worship of this God then must be prepared to sacrifice and suffer in order for us to truly know what it means to be His follower.